Welcome. Before we dive into this shocking true story, tell me where you're watching from and make sure to subscribe because a lot of work went into uncovering every detail of these events. This is the story of a slave in Baton Rouge whose fury and strength left 5 men bloodied in just 2 nights, a tale of terror, survival, and brutality that history rarely dares to tell. The story begins deep in the heart of Baton Rouge during the mid-19th century, on a sprawling plantation where the air was thick with the smell of sweat, earth, and unspoken fear. Life for the enslaved people was grueling and unforgiving. They toiled from sunrise to sunset, tending to the crops, repairing buildings, and performing every task the owners demanded, often under the lash of whips or the threat of punishment. Among them was a slave whose name has been lost to history, a man whose presence was quiet, almost unassuming at first glance. He moved with a careful watchfulness, keeping his head down, speaking only when necessary, and never drawing attention to himself. Yet, beneath this exterior, there was a strength, a cunning, and a simmering anger that would soon erupt in a way that none on the plantation could have anticipated. The plantation itself was a labyrinth of fields, cabins, and outbuildings, each space echoing with the cries of those forced into servitude. The owners prided themselves on discipline and control, believing that strict oversight could suppress any spark of rebellion. Overseers patrolled the fields, whip in hand, eyes sharp for any hint of defiance or hesitation. The slaves had learned to navigate this dangerous landscape, relying on observation, stealth, and silence. Among these men and women, the future savage of Baton Rouge had quietly honed his awareness, noting weaknesses in the overseer's routines, predicting movements, and understanding the rhythms of both the masters and his fellow slaves. His daily life was filled with labor that tested the limits of human endurance. He planted and harvested crops under the blazing sun, repaired fences and barns, and performed chores that would leave most men exhausted. Yet, he seemed to carry a reservoir of energy that others did not understand. Fellow slaves sometimes noticed his peculiar composure in the face of brutality. When others flinched at the snap of a whip or the barked commands of an overseer, he remained steady, his gaze unwavering, his mind working quietly to understand the power dynamics surrounding him. In a world built on oppression, he became an observer, studying how authority functioned, how fear could be manipulated, and how moments of weakness could be exploited. Beyond his physical abilities, there was an intelligence and cunning that set him apart. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight among the other enslaved people. He had learned to read both body language and emotion, detecting the tension in an overseer's step or the subtle hesitation in a master's command. While others lived in a state of constant, anxious reaction, he seemed to anticipate every movement, every opportunity, and every risk. This combination of patience, intelligence, and physical strength made him formidable long before any violent actions came to pass. Yet, the most important aspect of his character was his simmering anger, not blind rage, but a deep, carefully contained fury born from years of injustice, humiliation, and pain. Every punishment, every insult, every denial of basic humanity fueled a fire within him. It was a fire that would remain hidden until the precise moment when it could erupt with maximum effect. Those around him saw only the calm, controlled man, never suspecting the storm that lay beneath. It is within this setting, the relentless labor, the oppressive surveillance, and the quiet, simmering tension among the enslaved and the overseers, that the story of the savage of Baton Rouge truly begins. Understanding his environment, his careful observation, and the pressure cooker of fear and resentment that surrounded him is key to comprehending the events of the 2 nights that would leave 5 men bloodied and terrified. This was a man shaped not only by the cruelty of those who held him in bondage, but also by his own patience, intelligence, and calculated awareness, all of which would soon converge in a series of events that no one on the plantation would ever forget. The events leading up to the first night of violence on the Baton Rouge plantation were the result of months, perhaps even years, of simmering tension and careful observation by the slave who would later earn the moniker of the savage. Life on the plantation was harsh, but it was the subtle injustices, the petty cruelties, the public humiliations, the relentless oppression that planted the seeds for what was about to unfold. The overseers were particularly harsh men, proud of their ability to instill fear, and they had little patience for what they considered insolence or laziness. Every day, the slave watched them, noting their habits, their weak points, and the small lapses in their vigilance. He was patient, silent, waiting for the right moment to act, but the tension in the air grew with every lash struck and every command barked. Rumors of rebellion and defiance circulated quietly among the enslaved people, whispers exchanged in the dead of night. Yet, this man did not speak of revolt. Instead, he observed. He took note of the timings of patrols, the paths overseers would take between the fields, and the times when their attention wandered. Even the smallest details mattered. The way one overseer favored a particular drink and would often linger near it, or how another had a habit of tapping his fingers against the railing when nervous. Every detail was stored, committed to memory, and analyzed. What appeared to outsiders as a quiet, unassuming demeanor was actually a careful strategy. A patient waiting for the perfect moment when the balance of fear and opportunity would tip in his favor. On the day before the first attack, tension on the plantation reached a fever pitch. The overseers had singled him out for some minor perceived infraction, a task done too slowly, a glance that was interpreted as insolence. He had been humiliated in front of others, a public display meant to break the spirit. But instead, it strengthened his resolve. He retreated into the shadows, quietly nursing the anger and humiliation, allowing it to fuel a determination that would become unstoppable. Fellow enslaved individuals noticed his unusual focus and stillness that day. There was something different, an intensity in his gaze that was almost predatory, though they could not fully understand it. As night fell, he began to put his careful planning into motion. The first night of violence was not spontaneous. It was the culmination of careful surveillance, patience, and a deep understanding of human behavior. He moved silently through the plantation, avoiding detection with an almost preternatural awareness of his surroundings. Every step, every breath was measured. He knew where the overseers would be and when their attention would wane. When he struck, it would be swift and devastating, leaving his targets no time to react. The night itself seemed to conspire with him. The cover of darkness, the quieted fields, and the stillness of the air all serving as allies in what he had planned. The plantation was unaware of the storm approaching. The overseers, confident in their dominance, had no idea that someone was watching, waiting, and preparing to turn their own fear against them. This calm before the storm, the deceptive quiet, allowed him to move like a shadow, blending into the night, while his mind calculated each movement, each strike. It was the kind of preparation that only comes from years of observation and the careful cultivation of patience, a deadly combination of intellect and opportunity. Finally, the night arrived. Every detail of the preceding days, every insult, every injustice, every pattern of the overseer's behavior culminated in action. The plantation, a place where fear had long dictated behavior, would experience it from a new angle. For the first time, those who wielded power without conscience would encounter a force they could not predict, a fury and skill that would leave them bloodied and disoriented. This was not merely an act of rebellion. It was the precise execution of a carefully laid plan, an eruption of long, suppressed rage paired with unmatched cunning. The events leading up to that first night of violence highlight a critical aspect of this story. The actions that shocked Baton Rouge were not born from recklessness or random impulse. They were the product of observation, intelligence, patience, and a simmering anger that had been fueled by oppression and humiliation. The plantation itself, with its rigid hierarchy and culture of fear, had unwittingly created the conditions for its own disruption. The first night would be the turning point, the moment when a quiet, unassuming slave transformed into a figure of terror, forever changing the memory of that plantation and the men who had once considered themselves untouchable. The savage acts that left the first men injured on the Baton Rouge plantation were sudden, shocking, and precise, demonstrating both physical power and an acute understanding of human vulnerability. The first night began quietly, with the usual sounds of the plantation settling into darkness, crickets chirping, wind rustling through the trees, and the distant groans of animals in their pens. No one suspected that violence was imminent. The men, confident in their authority, had relaxed into routine, believing that the day's labor had exhausted the slaves, and that the night offered them a safe, unchallenged control over the estate. They were wrong. He struck without warning. The first man to encounter him was an overseer known for his cruelty, someone who had publicly humiliated him earlier that week. The slave's approach was silent, careful, like a predator moving through tall grass. 1 second, the overseer was walking along the path back to his quarters. The next, he was on the ground, clutching a wound that had appeared faster than anyone could comprehend. The slave had used the shadows, the terrain, and a concealed object to incapacitate him. The injury was not fatal, but it left the man staggering, disoriented, and drenched in his own blood. Panic rippled through the men nearby. They had never seen such skill, such control over the moment, executed by someone they had always considered powerless. The second and third men, coming to aid their companion, were also caught off guard. They underestimated him, assuming they could easily subdue a single enslaved man. But he had anticipated every move. He struck with remarkable precision, targeting vulnerable areas. A shoulder here, a rib there, leaving his opponents bruised, bleeding, and stunned. The plantation, usually a place where authority was enforced through fear and brutality, was suddenly a stage of chaos. Men who had felt untouchable moments before now found themselves injured, struggling to comprehend how a single slave could wield such power and cunning. Observers from a distance noted his movements with a mixture of awe and terror. This was no wild, frenzied attack. It was methodical, deliberate, and devastating. The slave moved like someone who had spent years studying his targets, learning their weaknesses, and planning for the precise moment when he could act without hesitation. Each strike, each maneuver, was executed with a level of awareness that left no room for error. The men who had once controlled him through intimidation now experienced the reversal of power in its most brutal form. The chaos of the first night spread quickly. By the time the fourth and fifth men encountered him, fear had already taken hold. They hesitated, second, guessing every step, unsure where the threat would come from next. And he exploited this hesitation expertly, using it against them. His attacks were swift and overwhelming, leaving the men bloodied and disoriented. The cries of pain and confusion echoed through the plantation, alerting others but offering little hope of intervention. By the time anyone could react, he had already disappeared into the darkness, leaving his victims incapacitated, their pride shattered, and their authority questioned. This first wave of violence sent a clear message, not just to the men he had injured, but to the entire plantation. The rules of power had shifted, if only briefly. The quiet, watchful slave had demonstrated that control could be seized. That physical strength paired with intelligence and strategy could upend the hierarchy that had been so brutally enforced. His actions left a lingering psychological impact. The injured men were not only physically harmed, but deeply shaken. The idea that someone they had long considered powerless could strike with such skill and effectiveness challenged every assumption they held about authority, obedience, and fear. The first night's savage acts were more than a display of strength. They were a calculated statement. Every injury inflicted, every strategy employed, revealed a mind that had been observing and planning for months, fueled by the injustices and humiliations suffered under the overseer's control. It was the first chapter in a brief but unforgettable campaign of terror that would leave 5 men bloodied in just 2 nights, altering the memory of the plantation forever. Those first victims would carry not only their physical wounds, but the psychological scar of encountering someone who defied the very laws of oppression, demonstrating that even the most tightly controlled environment could be disrupted by a single, determined, and intelligent individual. The second night of violence on the Baton Rouge plantation was even more intense and calculated than the first, revealing the full extent of the slave's cunning and physical prowess. After the initial attacks, fear had already begun to ripple through the plantation. The men who had been injured were recovering, but the memory of pain and humiliation lingered, making them wary and hesitant. However, this very fear played directly into the slave's hands. He understood that terror could be weaponized, and the tension in the air made his actions even more effective. While the first night had been a demonstration of raw skill and precision, the second night would show the terrifying combination of strategy, patience, and psychological manipulation. The slave did not strike immediately. Instead, he used the day to observe the plantation's reactions, noting where the men lingered, how they moved cautiously through the fields, and which paths were now avoided. He noted their sleep schedules, the rotation of the guards, and even the ways in which they attempted to fortify their quarters. Every precaution they took only revealed more about their habits and fears. By exploiting these small but critical details, he was able to plan an even more devastating assault. The second night was not a spontaneous outbreak of violence. It was a meticulously orchestrated act designed to leave an unmistakable mark on the men and the plantation itself. As darkness fell, the slave moved silently, blending with the shadows and using the terrain to his advantage. He approached his first target of the night with the same patience and awareness that had defined his actions before, striking with precision at the exact moment his victim was most vulnerable. This time, the injuries were more severe, leaving the man barely able to stand and sending shockwaves through the nearby quarters. The other men, now aware that he had survived the first night, were on high alert, but their heightened anxiety made them slower and more hesitant, exactly the effect he intended. Each encounter on the second night was carefully timed and executed. He seemed to anticipate every reaction, predicting their movements and countering them with unmatched efficiency. The second night's violence was not only physical, but psychological. The men were forced to confront the reality that someone they had considered powerless could not only resist, but dominate them with terrifying ease. They were no longer simply injured, they were humiliated, disoriented, and shaken to the core. The psychological impact was as important to him as the physical injuries. He understood that fear could be just as controlling as a whip or a lash. By the time the second night concluded, all 5 men had been left bloodied, some severely injured, others simply traumatized by the experience. The plantation, once a place of rigid authority, now felt like a trap, each shadow and sound a potential threat. Even those who had not been directly attacked felt the tension, a creeping anxiety that spread silently among the workers and the overseers alike. The slaves' actions had not only inflicted immediate harm, but had fundamentally disrupted the hierarchy of power on the plantation. The fear he instilled ensured that the memory of these nights would linger far longer than any physical wound. Word of the events spread quickly, carried quietly by those who witnessed or heard the aftermath. Whispers of the savage slave began to circulate beyond the plantation itself, inspiring awe and fear in equal measure. People were forced to acknowledge that the man they had dismissed as powerless was far more capable and dangerous than anyone could have imagined. His combination of intelligence, observation, patience, and raw strength allowed him to manipulate the environment, exploit vulnerabilities, and create chaos in a system built on control and oppression. The second night cemented his reputation. The events were no longer isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern that revealed a deliberate strategy, a carefully executed plan that turned fear against the oppressors. It demonstrated that resistance could take many forms, not just rebellion en masse but precise, calculated actions that challenged authority and left a lasting impression. The plantation would never be the same again, and the men who survived were left to live with the memory of 2 nights when their power was utterly shattered. Ultimately, the second night of violence revealed the full depth of the savage slave's abilities. He was not merely reacting to cruelty. He was orchestrating events with careful thought, exploiting weaknesses, and using the very fear imposed on him as a weapon. The combination of physical skill, strategic intelligence, and psychological insight made him a force that could not be ignored. By the end of that night, the plantation had been transformed from a place of unquestioned authority into a landscape of fear, uncertainty, and awe, leaving an indelible mark on those who lived through the horror of his calculated fury. The reactions of the plantation owners and the surrounding community to the savage slaves' attacks were immediate, intense, and fueled by a mix of fear, disbelief, and anger. When word of the 2 nights of bloodshed spread, the plantation quickly became a scene of chaos and tension. The owners, who had always relied on authority and intimidation to maintain control, were confronted with a reality they had never anticipated. One of their slaves had not only defied them, but had done so with an efficiency and ruthlessness that challenged every assumption about power and obedience. Their first reaction was disbelief. How could a single man, someone they had considered weak and powerless, execute such violence and escape without being captured? This question haunted them, and the uncertainty only amplified their fear. The owners began to mobilize their immediate resources, summoning overseers, laborers, and even trusted neighbors to track the slave and restore order. Armed searches were conducted through the fields, the quarters, and the surrounding woods. Horses were saddled, dogs were unleashed, and patrols scoured every corner of the plantation. Yet, despite these exhaustive efforts, the slave was never caught. He seemed to vanish into the shadows, always one step ahead, exploiting the plantation's terrain and the fear in the men who pursued him. Each failed attempt to capture him deepened the terror and frustration of the owners, leaving them anxious and on edge, unable to protect themselves or maintain control. The surrounding community soon caught wind of the events. News traveled quickly through Baton Rouge and nearby plantations, carried in whispers and hushed conversations. People were fascinated, horrified, and unsettled by reports of the savage slaves' feats. Some dismissed the accounts as exaggeration or rumor, but the consistency of the stories and the visible injuries of the victims made disbelief difficult. Families and plantation owners alike began to take precautions. Doors were reinforced, weapons were kept close, and gatherings of slaves were monitored more rigorously. The mere presence of the slave, the unknown threat he represented, created a climate of tension that spread far beyond the initial plantation. Psychological effects were just as profound as the physical injuries inflicted. The men who had been attacked were traumatized, their confidence shattered. They had once walked the plantation with an air of authority, but after 2 nights of brutal assaults, even minor noises or shadows could make them jump. This fear extended to the other enslaved workers as well. While most remained loyal to the plantation out of necessity or survival, there was a growing recognition that the balance of power had shifted, at least temporarily. The slave had demonstrated that skill, cunning, and courage could overcome brute authority, planting a seed of fear that would linger in the hearts of both oppressors and the oppressed. In response, the owners attempted to reassert control through stricter measures and harsher discipline. Curfews were enforced, work schedules were intensified, and punishments were carried out with increased severity. But these actions often backfired, exacerbating tension and creating further resentment. It became clear that traditional methods of dominance, intimidation, corporal punishment, and public humiliation were no longer sufficient to contain the threat posed by the slave. The attacks had undermined the authority of the owners in a fundamental way, challenging the very system they depended upon to maintain order. Beyond immediate measures, the events began to take on a symbolic significance. Among the community, stories about the savage slave were told and retold, often with embellishment, until the man became larger than life, a figure who represented both terror and awe. In a society structured by rigid hierarchies and fear, his ability to defy and inflict harm on those considered untouchable was deeply unsettling. He became a reminder that even the most entrenched systems of power could be disrupted by cunning, strength, and daring. The lasting impression on the plantation owners and their peers was a combination of humiliation and helplessness. Their authority, which had been absolute, had been directly challenged and undermined. For years afterward, the memory of those 2 nights remained vivid, haunting the men who had survived, coloring the way they interacted with their slaves and neighbors. The savage slaves' actions were not quickly forgotten, nor were they easily explained. They left a lasting mark, not only in the physical injuries he inflicted, but in the collective consciousness of the community, a chilling reminder that power could shift in an instant, and that one determined individual could change the balance entirely. Ultimately, the reactions of the plantation owners and the community reveal just how profoundly the savage slave's actions disrupted the social order. His carefully executed violence exposed vulnerabilities, instilled fear, and challenged deeply ingrained assumptions about control, obedience, and human capability. These responses, panic, increased surveillance, harsher discipline, and widespread rumor, demonstrate the full impact of his actions, showing that his legacy extended far beyond the 2 nights of bloodshed and into the psyche of an entire community, leaving them forever altered by a man they had underestimated. The legacy and mystery surrounding the savage slave of Baton Rouge extended far beyond the 2 nights of violence that left 5 men bloodied. Even after the immediate events had passed, stories of his strength, cunning, and the terror he inspired continued to ripple through the plantation and the surrounding communities. He became more than just a man, he became a legend, a figure that embodied both fear and fascination. People spoke of him in hushed tones, and his name, though lost to history, was remembered through the tales of those who had witnessed or heard of his actions. The legend persisted because his feats had defied expectation, undermining the perceived invincibility of the overseers and plantation owners, and challenging the social order that had long seemed unshakable. The immediate aftermath of the attacks left a psychological imprint that no amount of time could erase. The men who survived were forever changed, wary of shadows and sudden movements, constantly reminded of the power of someone they had once considered powerless. Even after the slave disappeared into the night, or possibly moved to another location, his presence was felt in the heightened fear and tension among the plantation staff. Orders were given more cautiously, workers were monitored more closely, and every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves was met with suspicion. His actions had created a legacy of vigilance, an awareness that authority could be challenged in ways previously unimaginable. Beyond the plantation itself, stories of the savage slave spread across Baton Rouge and neighboring estates. The details of his attacks were recounted with both awe and trepidation, often growing more dramatic with each retelling. Neighbors and other plantation owners whispered about a man who could strike with deadly precision and vanish into the shadows, leaving chaos and fear in his wake. He became a cautionary tale, used to warn both slaves and overseers to the former, as a reminder of the potential for resistance and cunning even under oppression, and to the latter, as proof that authority could be broken if underestimated. This duality of fear and respect became a defining aspect of his enduring legacy. Historians and storytellers have long debated what truly occurred during those 2 nights, attempting to separate fact from legend. Some argue that his acts were purely physical, a desperate assertion of self-preservation and retaliation against cruelty. Others suggest there may have been elements of strategy and psychological warfare, a deliberate effort to instill fear and assert a form of control that had been denied him for so long. Regardless of interpretation, the impact of his actions was undeniable. The story of the savage slave challenged the conventional understanding of power dynamics on plantations, showing that ingenuity, courage, and determination could disrupt even the most oppressive systems. The mystery surrounding him only deepened with time. No records detail his fate after those nights of violence, and no account fully explains how he accomplished such feats or where he went afterward. This absence of closure contributed to the mythic quality of his story, allowing imagination and speculation to fill the gaps. Was he ever captured? Did he escape to freedom? Or did he remain in hiding, a silent observer on plantations still ruled by fear? The lack of answers turned him into an almost supernatural figure in local memory, a symbol of resistance that could not be easily contained or forgotten. The legend also influenced how enslaved communities perceived themselves and their capacity for defiance. Tales of the savage slave were whispered among workers, inspiring both hope and caution. He became a representation of what could happen when someone refused to accept subjugation silently, a reminder that resilience, intelligence, and strategic action could challenge even the most entrenched systems of oppression. For generations, these stories reinforced the understanding that power was not absolute and that the human spirit could find ways to assert itself, even under the harshest conditions. Over time, the story evolved into folklore, blending documented events with mythic embellishments. Some accounts describe him moving like a shadow through the night, striking unseen, while others credit him with almost superhuman strength and foresight. While it is impossible to verify the exact details, the consistent theme across all accounts is clear. He was a force of nature, a man who defied expectations, and a figure whose actions left an indelible mark on everyone who experienced or heard of them. Even today, the tale of the savage slave serves as a chilling reminder of the potential for defiance, intelligence, and courage in the face of oppression. It highlights the fragility of assumed authority and the way fear can shift power dynamics instantly. His story remains both a historical account and a symbol, bridging the line between reality and legend, and preserving the memory of a man who turned desperation and oppression into an unforgettable act of resistance. Ultimately, the legacy of the savage slave of Baton Rouge is one of mystery, fear, and enduring fascination. He demonstrated that one individual, armed with cunning, patience, and determination, could disrupt a carefully maintained system of control. His story continues to capture imaginations, reminding all who hear it that power is never guaranteed, authority can be challenged, and the echoes of courage can resonate long after the events themselves have faded into history.